I'd like to welcome everybody back for new study. Tonight we're going to take a look at, this may surprise you, but we're actually going to look at a document that is a document that is contemporary to the New Testament documents. This is one of those documents that did not make it into the New Testament, but was written at the same time as a lot of the literature in the New Testament was written. And it's called the Didache. You want to say that? Didache. Which is Greek for the teaching. So it would be, it had a title, The Teaching of the Apostles. And this book, this particular document, we knew of its existence because reference was made to the Didache by other ancient Christian writers. So they were aware of its existence. But the document itself was lost until the 19th century, that is the 1800s. A Greek Orthodox monk discovered a manuscript of the Didache, and so it became available once again, and so it was a rediscovery of this document. I think that the value of reading this document together is that it will cast some light on what was going on in the church while the New Testament was still, much of it still being written, and before there ever was really a New Testament. And so I thought it would be really helpful to read through this document together. One of the things that will strike you is, and something that became very noticeable to many scholars, is that that's not it. I thought I had another one, another copy. So it's really important that we get you a copy, John, of this. So
Here, John can have mine. Gay has one. John, here, take mine. Gay has one. I can share with Gay.
Will she share with you?
It'll be in the notes.
I hope so.
We'll have a whole text.
yeah. So you'll get it in the notes as well. I'm sorry I didn't make it. This is actually a good kind of problem to run out of something. Usually I have a stack left over. So, John, why don't you join us? Why don't you sit down?
I can read back.
Okay, you're good? Okay, all right.
If everybody else is okay.
Yeah, are you all okay with John sitting over there by himself?
No.
We're gonna have a
Okay. And so one of the things that is, and it became very apparent to me as well, is how this document has a real affinity to the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And so this would suggest to us that it was written around the same time as the Gospel of Matthew, and it was drawing upon some of the material that Matthew was drawing upon when the Gospel of Matthew was being compiled, written and compiled. And I wrote up here a timeline. It's generally believed by most historians and scholars that the crucifixion of Jesus took place in the year 30, in the spring of the year 30. We believe, most people believe, that Saul of Tarsus was converted within about 2 years after that event, when the church primarily was still in Jerusalem. And you know that story. Then here's the middle of the first century, which would be 20 years afterwards. And by this time, Paul had already written the First Thessalonians. And I believe that he also wrote Galatians. I favor early date for Galatians. But Romans and the bulk of Paul's writings were really probably written in the decade after 50, in what we would call the 50s of the first century. And then the later writings probably in the decade of the 60s. Paul was martyred in Rome, we believe, under the reign of Nero during the first Roman official persecution of the church, the Neronian institution, and that happened in about 64, 65, so the middle of what are the 60s, but are considered the 7th decade of the first century. Then 70 AD is another important year because that is when the great catastrophe of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written around the time of Nero's persecution before the destruction of Jerusalem. And then many scholars believe that then the Gospel of Matthew and Luke was sometime in the next 20 years after 70 AD. So this is when they believe. But what's important to us at this moment is that Matthew's Gospel was written about the year 80. Most scholars believe about 10 years afterwards, as we have it now. Of course, when we say written, a lot of this material already existed in written form quite early, and the gospel writers as we have them now were pretty much, particularly Matthew and Luke, were actually compiling sources of material that they had. And so Matthew, as we know, came into existence here, but Matthew was relying on a source, yes?
So Matthew wrote it in the...
Well, his name is associated with it, and the tradition of the church is that Matthew wrote it. But the Gospel of Matthew is really anonymous. The writer never identifies who he is. But the name of Matthew is associated with it. And I think there's some credibility to that because why would they pick out Matthew when there was more prominent apostles to sign these? Why didn't they say Peter, James, or someone else? But there is the tradition of Matthew. So we believe there was a Matthean community, probably in Syria or Palestine, where a lot of that material was gathered, and then out of this community comes the Gospel of Matthew. So by the time it's published, probably Matthew has been dead by this time. But that we really don't know. See, a lot of this is speculation. We don't have any documentary evidence to suggest any of this, so we're doing a lot of guesswork. So I believe that Matthew is the personality behind the Gospel of Matthew, meaning that he is one of the major sources. And perhaps he was literate, obviously. He was a tax collector. And so he would have the skill to be able to write it. He was considered an eyewitness. There's strong testimony of him being among the 12. So there's no reason not to believe that Matthew is really the one behind the Gospel of Matthew. But in its final form, ancient documents seldom written just by one person. Usually it's written by a school or a group of people. And the Gospels seem to suggest that, the way they're compiled and put together. They're edited materials.
Would Matthew have written that in Greek? How would he?
Well, he would have known Greek. It was to be a government official, which is what he was, he would have known Greek. However, the suggestion has been made that portions of the Gospel of Matthew were written in Aramaic, which he was a Palestinian Jew. He was an Aramaic-speaking Jew. And Jesus spoke Aramaic. But at Matthew, as we have it, is the Greek version that comes down to us. And so we believe that this time was when it was written. Yes?
Did I understand you to say on the timeline that the the death of Paul was somewhere around when?
It would be in the mid-60s, 64.
So that, we think that happened during the persecution of Nero.
Yeah,
Nero.
and the tradition is very strong for that.
So, but that, I never connected to my mind before, that's around the same time as the final revolt in Israel.
Yeah.
Are they, are they somehow related? The purge of Nero, or is it totally unrelated?
No, well, it's not totally unrelated, but there's no causal relationship. Nero was emperor at this time, and then he was the one, for political reasons, needed to find a scapegoat for the burning of Rome.
Yeah.
So he blamed the minority called the Christians, because the Jews were already kicked out, so they had to find somebody. And that was a horrific time, and the tradition of the church is, and it's pretty unanimous, from later, when we say tradition, these are writers that are not contemporaries that wrote later. There's no conflict. They pretty much, whoever wrote about it, agreed that Peter and Paul were martyred at that time in Rome. Peter was, the tradition is, was crucified upside down in the Roman circus. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, and that was considered a merciful way of applying capital punishment, where crucifixion is designed to cause you to suffer. So that's the tradition that we have. Then there is a tradition that says that Mark's gospel was really the preaching of Peter that John Mark put into writing. And so the suggestion is that the gospel according to Mark, which we believe is the earliest one, would have had to have been written when Peter was still around. But it's written in a hurry. It's rushed, which means that the conditions of which it was being written, they were under duress. So probably the writer, will say Mark, who was a companion of Peter in Rome, that he was aware that time was growing short and we're going to lose Peter. Let's get this down into writing. Another thing that about the Gospel of Mark is that it suggests that the community it emerged from was a community who was experiencing persecution. There's some internal evidence, that is, if you read the text carefully, it seems to be something that's informed by that experience. I won't get into the details of that now.
Right.
So that would make sense that it was published or written during the Neronian, or the persecution by Nero. And then there's also something unique to Mark in the text. There are certain Greek words that are actually Latin words, which would suggest they're Latinizations. You know how we have, we anglicize certain words? Well, it was a Latinization of certain Greek words. This does not appear in the other three Gospels, and this would suggest Rome, because Rome is where Latin was prevalent, even though Greek at this time was the official language of the empire. The people in Rome still spoke Latin to each other. So these things would indicate that Mark's gospel had its origin in Rome. The Matthew we don't know as much about, but we do know that most of Mark ends up in Matthew, so that a copy of Mark's gospel was in the possession of the Matean community, and then they added material to it. They also shaped it and made changes to some of the stuff that Mark had written. And this is really important. Is this interesting to you?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is really important stuff, because if you compare Mark, it's pretty much unanimous that that's the earliest gospel. And we can see clearly that both Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel is using Mark as the basis, and they expand it. But it says a lot about the interests of their community and of the gospel writer or compiler by how he changes Mark, or how he shapes Mark, or what he leaves out, or how he expands Mark. So when we get Matthew's gospel, it's not simply that he inserted Mark there. He inserted it, but he shaped it and changed it. And then the question for scholars, what they're trying to figure out, why did he change it in this way? And why did Matthew change it this way and Luke did it a different way? Well, because the contemporary communities in which they were a part of that were producing these gospels had particular interests.
Right.
Like in Mark's gospel, you have Jesus saying that divorce is just, divorce just and remarriage is impossible. It's just black and white. There's no room for divorce. You get the same passage in Matthew and you get an exception. Divorce is acceptable in the cases of fornication. And then we're kind of left, what does that mean? So in the Matean community, they were a little bit more flexible about divorce and remarriage than Mark's community. So you can already see development and special interests starting to shape the material that they're writing. Now, I'm giving you this whole thing about the dating of the New Testament documents because the Didache was probably written around the same time as Matthew's Gospel. And you will see that as we look at this text. So this is a document that's contemporary with the New Testament documents, and it did not get included in the New Testament. And yet we have later documents that did. For example, the Apocalypse, or the Revelation of St. John the Divine, we call it, the book of Revelation. That was written in the 90s, we believe. Most people would believe that it was written in the 90s. And so that would have been one of the last books written, but it got included in the New Testament, strangely enough, but not without controversy. Revelation almost didn't make it into the New Testament. And it was a compromise that got it included. For example, there were churches in the East that wanted to include the Apocalypse or Revelation. But interesting enough, the Roman Christians in Rome objected to it. And then the book of Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, was something that the Roman Christians wanted included, but the Christians of the East did not want to, so they compromised and included both. If you'll take Revelation, we'll take the book of Hebrews. So a lot of times the canon coming together was as arbitrary as that, and it took centuries for the canon to form. But by this time, when the canon was coming together, this book that we're looking at was lost, as far as we know. And I thought you would be amazed by some of the material that is included here. And as I was putting this together, I also cited different passages of Matthew, which is similar to what this writer has here. Yes?
Isn't there also talk about another document that they think that was a source material for, they call it Q or something like that?
Yeah, but this is a hypothetical document. It's called Q, not to be confused with the character on Star Trek. And it's initial for the German word, Quell, which is in source. Because when you do a careful literary analysis of Luke's gospel and you do it of Matthew's gospel, you recognize immediately that they're both heavily dependent upon Mark's gospel. Basically, they took Mark's gospel and inserted it and then expanded it and added their material. So the one thing that Matthew and Luke have in common, or one thing they have in common, is they're both looking at the Gospel of Mark, which has already been circulated throughout the church by this time. And Luke will tell you, the writer of Luke's gospel tells you up front, that's how he wrote his gospel. He collected all the sources that were available to him and he tried to bring it all together into a cohesive narrative. Well, not only does Luke and Matthew have material that is clearly taken over, we would say that was
Plagiarism.
plagiarized.
Yeah.
They didn't have that concept in the ancient world. So they plagiarized Mark. But also there is material that is found in Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel that are the same or similar.
But not found in Mark.
But not found in Mark. So now we know that Luke and Matthew had two sources that they both used. One was Mark's gospel, and another was a hypothetical document called Q. Q is that material that is common to Matthew and Luke, but you don't find in Mark's gospel. I know it gets kind of complicated. Yes, throw in something.
The Q is sayings of Jesus, exclusively sayings. It's not narrative, it's not stories, it's sayings. And scholars were guessing that there was such a source for quite some time, and then in the 1940s, when the Nag Hammadi library was found down in Egypt that has the Gnostic Gospels in it, they found a complete copy of something called the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is just sayings of Jesus, and that gives quite a bit of credibility to the idea that there was originally a list of sayings of Jesus that was used then by Luke and by Matthew.
That were circulated.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, that is true, and it's called the Gospel. Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas. It's just a collection of sayings, no narrative material at all in there. So, now there is material in Matthew's Gospel which is not found in Luke's Gospel and not found in Mark's Gospel. So that suggests that Matthew's Gospel had yet an independent source, and that source is called M. It's material that is unique only to Matthew's Gospel. And then in Luke's Gospel, you have the same situation. There's material only found in Luke. For example, the familiar Christmas story. Even though Matthew has a nativity story, it's nothing like what's found in Luke. The nativity of John the Baptist, the visit of Mary to Elizabeth, the Annunciation. These are unique to Luke's Gospel. The visit in the temple when Simeon and Anna come up. Also, the parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son is only found in Luke's Gospel. The story of the road to Emmaus, only found in Luke's Gospel. The thief on the cross who's repentant, the good thief, we talk about it, that's only in Luke's Gospel. So we call that material that you only find in Luke's Gospel, the source of that behind that is source L.
Shocking.
I like it.
So, let me, yeah, I was going to write that diagram up here. Yeah. I think you can help me with this. So you have Q, okay?
Yeah.
You have Mark. You have M, and you have L. These are hypothetical, other than Mark, these are hypothetical sources of material. So, when Matthew's gospel was being put together, they were drawing from Mark. They were drawing from this material called Q, and also from here. Okay? That's Matthew's gospel. Then Luke's gospel is drawing also from Mark, also drawing from Q, but nothing from the end source, but from another source that we call L. And that's how they come up with their gospel. And this is called the four-document hypothesis. So that's, and we're not talking about John's gospel, because John reflects an entirely different tradition. John's gospel is so different. These are how we think the synoptic gospels were put together. Is that what you had?
No, my diagram's a little bit different, but it does the same thing.
Does the same thing, okay. Thank you, Diane. So, the writer of the Didache either had St. Matthew's gospel in some form available to him, which would suggest it's coming from the same community. We believe that the Matthean community that produced the gospel according to St. Matthew, of which the Apostle Matthew is identified as being the person behind, the apostolic person behind this community. We believe that that community was either in Syria or in Palestine. So the Eastern Mediterranean. So this would suggest that the Didache comes from the same community that had the same source material as Matthew's gospel, or Matthew's gospel itself. And you'll see this when you're reading this, as we read through this. And it's quite exciting to see that. Then, so this would mean that this probably comes from Syria or Palestine, the Christian community that existed there, in particular the Matthean community. It also has an affinity with the epistle to James.
Yeah.
Now, remember when we did a study of James, we said that there is an affinity between James and the Gospel of Matthew. There's an affinity there. Well, James is associated with the church, the mother church in Jerusalem. So that there is a relationship between the Gospel of Matthew, James, and the Didache. And when you read through this, you might respond in the same way I did, and as well as many other thoughtful people have responded. And that is, why didn't this book get into the New Testament? Because it's really a very useful book. So we believe that the Didache was a manual of some sort that was used to catechize the catechumens in preparation for baptism. And of course, the first thing that we're going to see in this book is that it begins with a focus on morality, how your lifestyle, how you live. Because in this generation of Christians, how you needed to know how to be a Christian. How is a Christian supposed to live? And so they give you what it looks like, how a Christian is to live. So it has a lot of morality. It's the reverse of Paul. Because in Paul, you have his theological development in his epistles, right? He gives his theology. And then towards the end of the epistle, he's now giving pastoral direction on how you should live in the light of his truth. This is the exact opposite. It starts with telling you how to live. So it shows you the importance of how they expected the new converts to transform and change the way that they have been living. Many of the converts were coming from the Gentile pagan world. Then it really doesn't have any theology in the sense of conceptual thought in this, but it tells us how the sacraments were celebrated. In particular, baptism and Eucharist, but also we get a look at the prayer life. And so we see in this here, we see in embryonic form what would later become the liturgy of the church. This is why this is so important to us. Now, we're not going to read this out loud together. It's too many pages. So we'll just start going through it, and I'll read it out loud, and then I'll stop and make some brief commentary. We're not going to analyze this like we've analyzed Romans. We're just going to read through this, and I want to do it all in one night. And I think we can do it. But if there's questions and conversation that makes it so we have to go to next week, I'm okay with that. You know, if it stimulates that much of our thinking.
At least 2 weeks.
Okay, so Martha's already said 2 weeks. Okay, and that will be okay. So here's how it begins in this book called The Teaching of the Apostles. There are two ways one of life and one of death. And there is a great difference between the two ways. The way of life is this. First, you shall love God who made you. And second, love your neighbor as yourself. And this can be compared with that. When I put Matthew in there, that's what, because there's an echo of that in Matthew. And, oh yes.
Is this your translation, or where does translation come from?
Well, what I did was, I looked at there was an English translation already provided, and I looked at the Greek text, and I made changes, but I did not translate this entire document. Because I thought the translation that was provided was pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it seems kind of conversational.
Yeah, yes, it is, and also, it's Koine Greek, so it's the same Greek that's being used by the New Testament writers.
Okay.
This is why this is such an early date. It goes back to the first generation, basically. The way of life is this: first, you shall love God who made you, and second, love your neighbor as yourself. That is an allusion to some of the wording there's from Matthew, when the scribe comes and asks, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus identifies those. And then he adds, and do not do to another what you would not want done to you. It is the golden rule, which is found in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, except it's stated in the negative. Jesus said in Matthew, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is stated in the positive. This is stating it in the negative. So this would almost suggest that he may not be looking at Matthew's gospel, but could be looking at Q. Verse 3, the meaning of these sayings is this: bless those who curse you and pray for your enemies. That, you heard that before in Matthew's gospel. But look of the difference here. And fast for those who persecute you. You're going to see that fasting was a big part of the early Christian church life in the first century. Because this is not the only reference to fasting, but they add, you also should fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there for loving those who love you? That's right from Matthew's gospel. Do not the heathens do the same? And I cite Matthew there. But you should love those who hate you, and then you shall have no enemies. Now that's new. I've never heard that before. And then you shall have no enemies. And then verse 4, abstain from fleshly and bodily lusts. If someone strikes your right cheek, turn the other also, and be perfect. You recognize that from Matthew's gospel. Why is that put with fleshly and bodily lusts? Because the urge to strike back at someone who strikes you is almost like a bodily impulse. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. If someone takes your cloak, give also your coat. If someone takes from you what is yours, do not ask for it back. And then it adds this word that's rather novel: you really cannot. Verse 5, give to everyone who asks of you, and do not ask for it back. The Father, that's referring to Abba, the Father of Jesus, the God the Father. The Father wants his blessings shared. Blessed is the giver who lives according to this rule, for that one is guiltless. But the receiver must beware. This is really interesting because you don't find this in any of the Gospels of the other side. The receiver must beware, for if one receives who has need, he is guiltless. But if one receives not having need, he shall stand trial, answering why he received and for what use. If he is found guilty, he shall not escape until he pays back the last penny. That he pays back the last penny is a direct quote of Jesus. But that, I thought that was a kind of an interesting thing about talking about the one who receives.
Well, then later on, you can tell that they have had some of these false teachers come in who were living off the fat of the land.
Yeah.
You know, so they're already having people who are posing as teachers who are trying to take advantage of the Christian community.
Very early on.
Very early, it
To
never ended.
people who want to use the teaching of Jesus to exploit others. And they're already now having to speak to that. And we get a glimpse into in the first generation, they were already having these problems.
So they had televangelists before TV.
Yeah. Oh, you gotta get that in there. Say it again.
They had televangelists before TV.
Oh, I'm sorry,
You wanna put that in there?
I will.
Okay. Verse 6, however, concerning this, there is a saying, let your alms sweat in your hands until you know to whom to give them. So don't quickly, you give alms, but don't do it so quickly. Let it develop sweat in your hands for a while, until you know whom you should give. Is that interesting to you? Okay. Yeah, that would have been good. Chapter 2. The second commandment of this teaching is this. Do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not corrupt boys. Pedophilia.
And that's really important.
Yes, very important. Do not have illicit sex. I think we all know what that means. Do not steal. Do not practice magic. Do not practice witchcraft. These were problems in the first century. You shall not murder a child. And what they're referring to, it was a common practice in ancient Greek and Roman society where if you were having too many children, and of course that was a problem, people would put their children out and expose them. In other words, take them out into the forest or out in a vacant lot and just leave them there, and some wild animal gets them, or they just die of exposure. This was a huge problem in the first century. Well, even longer than that. And the Christians would go out and rescue these children.
Wow.
And they were noted for that. We have records of this going on. So Christians went out and rescued these children.
What was the reason they were getting rid of them? Because they couldn't feed them or
Couldn't
take
feed
care of
them.
them?
Couldn't take care of them.
Take care of them. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a problem because there was a lot of poverty and
Oh, okay.
you put another mouth to feed.
It's not unknown now. Some societies where
Yeah.
you need, the culture says you need more males, will expose female infants, or when there are too many males to feed, expose. It's not unknown now.
Yeah. That is true in certain cultures and that. And then we have certain demented people who will, every once in a while you hear in the newspaper a child dies because they're not
Left in a
careful.
dumpster.
Also, if in Greek culture, if a child had any kind of abnormality physically, or they figured that there was something psychologically wrong, they'd cast the child out. They'd take it out and leave it out.
The Greeks did
The
that?
Greeks did that.
Really?
Were they also, in the Greek culture, were they sacrificing children to Balak?
I don't know about Greeks doing that, but the Phoenicians did, and the Carthaginians did.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought this was happening long before the first century.
It was.
Oh, yeah, this has been going on.
Because like way back when God has Abraham sacrifice Isaac,
Yeah,
so it was to stop child sacrifice. And
yeah,
that's where the Jews got to where they were sacrificing goats or sheep or doves or whatever instead of the children.
yeah. Well,
That was a big thing way back as far as the pagan world.
Moloch.
yeah,
That's the god that-
yeah, that's true.
Well,
Yeah, so child sacrifice as a religious act was more common than it's a horrific thought that they were doing this. Yeah, and the Canaanites did it in their religion, in the worship of Baal. And the Romans didn't practice child sacrifice for the most part, and when they conquered Carthage, they were disgusted because the Carthaginians, who were Phoenicians, but they were in North Africa, they practiced child sacrifice, and it was disgusting to the Romans. The Celts also practiced human sacrifice, but usually it was an adult. So human sacrifice has been around for a long time
Yeah.
by many peoples, and as recently as the 16th century, the Aztecs civilization was performing human sacrifice. So that's not all that long ago. So this has been with us for a long time. So that's what it means, you shall not murder a child, whether it be born or unborn. So this is the earliest reference we have to the Christian ethic of being against abortion. It shows up here.
You know, and this thing right here came out recently in Colorado, I believe. A lady, a woman was pregnant, and this other lady took the baby by C-section. I mean, she was
Cut it out of her.
cut out the
Yeah.
baby, and the Colorado law could not put that lady that did it up for murdering the baby, because their law states, well, how do we know it really lived?
Yeah.
That just happened.
Yeah, it just happened, and I just was like, ugh.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Do not covet the things of your neighbor. So you see a lot of the Ten Commandments there. Do not swear or bear false witness. Do not speak evil of others. Do not bear grudges. You should not be double-minded or double-tongued, for a double tongue is a deadly snare. And you'll see that this is very similar to what James is talking about in his letter, chapter 3, verse 1 through 12. Your speech should not be false or empty, but fulfilled by action. In other words, don't make false promises and not follow through on it. Do not be covetous or greedy or hypocritical or malicious or arrogant. Do not have designs against your neighbor. Hate no one. Correct some. Pray for others. And some you should love more than your own life. Interesting, huh? Then now we go to chapter 3. My child. Already we see that in this first, in the first century, that it was characteristic of Christian communities to use familial words in their relationships with one another. They would call someone your brother. The church saw itself as an extended family, brother, sister. St. Paul says, am I not a father to you, and you are my children? So the reason, even up to the present time, that in traditional Christianity, in Catholicism, we still use familial language to address one another. Brother, sister, father, mother, my child. These things go all the way back to the first century. My child, flee evil of all kinds and everything like it. Verse 2, do not be prone to anger, for anger leads to murder. Do not be jealous or quarrelsome or hot-tempered, for all these things lead to murder. Echoing the Sermon on the Mount there. My child, do not be lustful, for lust leads to illicit sex. Do not be a filthy talker, or allow your eyes a free rein, for these lead to adultery. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, remember that. Verse 4, my child, do not observe omens, since it leads to idolatry. Do not be an enchanter, or an astrologer, or a purifier, or be willing to see or hear about these things, for these all lead to idolatry. Do you see what he's doing? Do you see the pattern
What
here?
is a purifier?
I don't know. I don't know what that is. I wish I knew. I don't. So don't be an enchanter, someone who casts spells or uses the evil eye. Verse 5, my child, do not be a liar, since a lie leads to theft. Do not love money or seek glory, for these things lead to thievery. Do you see how he's grouping these together? The first group is murder, the second group adultery, the third group idolatry, and the fourth group thievery. My child, do not grumble, since it leads to blasphemy. If you're always complaining and getting mad and mouthing off, pretty soon you might be using God's name in vain. And I've been known to do that on occasion. And then I look around to see if anyone heard me. Especially my children.
Yeah.
Okay. Do not be self-willed or evil-minded, for all these things lead to blasphemy. On the contrary, be gentle, since the gentle will inherit the earth. That's one of the Beatitudes, which is found in Matthew's Gospel. Be long-suffering and pitiful and guileless and gentle and good, and with trembling treasure the words you have received. Do not exalt yourself or open your heart to overconfidence. Do not be on intimate terms with powerful people, but with just and lowly ones. Accept whatever happens to you as a blessing, knowing that nothing comes to pass apart from God. Isn't this good stuff?
Oh, yeah, I love this.
Verse 1 of chapter 4. My child, remember day and night the one who speaks the word of God to you, and honor that one as the Lord. For wherever his lordship is spoken of, there he is. So, the preacher and teacher, he's saying, speak well with them. I feel like it's self-serving for me to say anything more about that verse. Seek each day the faces of the holy ones. It's the same word as saints, holy ones. I was going to write saints there when I was looking at this, but I decided to put holy ones, because if I say saints, sometimes we're thinking of the cult of saints and not realizing what the writer means here is the members of your community. In order that you may be refreshed by their words. Do not initiate divisions, but rather bring peace to those who contend against one another. Judge righteously, and do not take social status into account when reproving for transgressions. And that is a reflection of what James instructs. Don't show partiality to the rich and powerful, and treat the lowly any differently. Number 4, do not waver in your decisions. Number 5, do not be one who opens his hands to receive or closes them when it is time to give. We're so quick to receive, slow to give. Got to be the opposite. If you have anything by your hands, you should give ransom for your sins. This kind of attitude would continue to develop in the church, is that that you need to make amends. The idea of that I need to. What's an example of that I could use, but I can't. Nothing comes to mind at the moment. Anyone have any idea what that might mean? Yeah, go right ahead.
Just penance.
What?
Penance.
Penance.
Penance, there you go. Verse 7, do not hesitate to give, and do not complain about it. You will know in time who is the good rewarder. God who sees you giving in secret will reward you. Do not turn away from one who is in want. Rather, share all things with your brother or sister, and do not say that they are your own. For if you are sharers in what is imperishable, how much more in things which perish? Verse 9, do not remove your hand from your son or daughter. Teach them the fear of God from their youth. Do not give orders to your servants when you are angry, for they hope in the same God. And they may lose the fear of God who is over both of you.
How does that work?
Fear God, or what?
How is it that giving orders to your servants when you're angry will make them lose the fear of God?
That's an interesting. Any thoughts about that? What's the correlation there?
Would they fear their master more than God?
Yeah, they might fear the master more than
Yeah.
God, or.
You heard the saying, we're gonna put the fear of God in him.
Yeah,
So what does that mean?
yeah. And fear of God is not, like being afraid of a ghost. It's more like being in awe and revering God,
Well,
Respect.
when you have someone who is your superior, who is always in your face, it's hard to think about your relationship with God when you're living in anxiety like that.
Right.
You know?
And if you think that, or if that person is who's abusing you, your superior,
Mhm.
and he's a person of faith, then that can turn you
Oh,
off.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think.
Oh, yeah, 'cause it's addressed to the church, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. 10 continues on the next page. God is surely not coming to call on us according to our outward appearance or situation in life, but to them whom the Spirit has prepared. Verse 11. And you, servants, be subject to your masters as to God's image. The word is icon. God's image. In modesty and fear. You should hate all hypocrisy and everything which is not pleasing to the Lord. Verse 13. Do not in any way neglect the commandments of the Lord, but keep what you have received, neither adding nor taking away anything. In your gatherings, that would be, he's referring to when the church gathers to celebrate Eucharist. Confess your transgressions, and do not come for prayer with a guilty conscience, echoing James. Confess your sins one to another. This is the way of life. So the practice of confession of sins is already this early, and it was done communally at the beginning of the liturgy. And in the liturgy today, we still have the penitential rite right at the beginning. Lord, when we say, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, or the Confiteor, these things should be done within, in a communal way, so that the rest of your prayer, you're not having a guilty conscience. So, very much sounds like Christian wisdom literature, doesn't it? Yeah. Remember, this is how they're instructing new converts. They're adapting a new way of life. They were more concerned with your behavior and how you live your life than theological concepts. It's very a pragmatic approach. And the Christian way of life, we live in a culture in which it permeates Christian values after so many centuries. But the Christian ethic, in many ways, this was very different than how the Greeks and Romans and others in the Roman Empire, the pagans, Gentiles were living. This is a radically new way of life. Now he's going to talk about the way of death. He's talked about the way of life. Verse 1 of chapter 5. The way of death, on the other hand, is this. It is evil and accursed. Murders, adulteries, lust, illicit sex, theft, idolatry, magical arts, sorceries, robberies, false testimonies, hypocrisy, double-heartedness. By the way, I want to say something here. One of the Beatitudes is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. You know that one?
Yeah.
And I used to think for a long time, that means, when I hear pure of heart, I automatically think of impure thoughts, and I think that Jesus is talking about lust. And he's not. The word there, that we say impure heart, means a divided heart. Someone who is double-minded. That's the pure. Pure in heart is the opposite of being double-minded. So when it said double-heartedness, that's very close to that beatitude that's recorded in Matthew's Gospel. Deceit, haughtiness, depravity, self-will, greediness, filthy talking, jealousy, overconfidence, loftiness, boastfulness. Those who do not fear God. That's quite a list. By the way, in the first century, they were fond of making lists of vices. People who wrote on ethics and philosophy would make these lists, and you'll see these in St. Paul's letters. He'll make a list of all the vices. This was a common thing that you would find in the literature of the first century, and we see it here in the Didache.
I have a question. It's come up twice now, this thing about magical arts and sorceries. Do we have any knowledge as to what, I mean, how that played out in their lifestyle, in their culture, or what?
Well,
was going on?
These things were, it was very common in the ancient world to put curses on people. And you would sometimes go to someone who was a sorcerer or a witch, and you would pay them to put a curse on someone. And there were many ways they would do it. They would get they would get something, a personal possession of yours, and take it to the sorcerer, and they would pronounce curses. The evil eye is another thing. So these things have still exist in different parts of the world.
Yeah, they still
Who
get
do?
babies with protection for the evil eye, because they work with infants.
Oh.
And they will often have a bracelet with protection for the evil eye.
Really?
Yeah, it still
Wow.
goes on. And in my travels to Morocco, there was all these plaques of protection for the evil eye.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
in many cultures, this is a very real
Yeah.
thing.
Yes, it is.
And wow. So that's what they're referring to, this kind of practice.
Thanks.
Does illicit sex refer to prostitution, or is it a broader category?
Yeah, illicit sex, this is the translation this translator used, but it's the same word. He's translating the same word as what we call fornication. It's sex outside of, and for the New Testament writers, it's sex outside of a legitimate relationship of like marriage. When we get into in the Bible, the views of what illicit sex changed over time. For example, it was not illicit for a man to go visit a prostitute in the Old Testament. He wasn't committing adultery, you know. When it said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," it meant two things, that commandment. It meant, do not have sex with another man's wife. Right? Don't do that. That's committing adultery. Or a woman cannot have sex with anyone but her husband. However, the husband could visit legitimately a prostitute or have sex with his concubine or servants. You know?
That was okay.
It was okay.
It was business.
Well, and the reason it developed that way, and it led to, I mean, it's sexism in the sense that the ancients didn't view women as equal to men.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But also, the problem is, you always know who the mother of a child is. So it had to do with inheritance. But the only way you can know that child, a man can know that child's mine, is to know that you haven't seen anyone else in the meantime. Sorry, but I'm not meaning you personally.
We know it.
Another thing it's important to bear in mind in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean world, because I don't know how they thought about it in other cultures, but the belief was that the entire human person was in the sperm. And that they had no idea that women had eggs and that they were contributing genetically to that. The woman was merely an incubator. So this is why masturbation was condemned, because it's murder. This is why homosexuality was condemned, because you were expending your seed, because it was murder. This is why you did not withdraw from intercourse before you deposit your seed and let it spill out. It was considered murder. But a lot of people nowadays, they don't know why these prohibitions existed, but it was because of their belief about what the sperm was. So, and that's why lineages were traced through the male line. They thought that was a direct, we now know that it doesn't work that way.
Why didn't the Jews, though, didn't your Jewishness come through your mother?
Yeah.
Well, that's a different situation. And this had to go with the thing is, they don't know if you're really Jewish unless your mother's Jewish. If your mother wasn't Jewish, there's no way to prove that the Jew who's the male is really the father. So for legal purposes, you are a Jew. If you have a mixed marriage, you are a Jew if your mother's Jewish, but we're not so sure. If your father's Jewish, we're not so sure he's the father. There's no way to prove that.
Yeah.
You see? But it wasn't because they thought somehow the mother imparted your Jewish identity or your life force. You know, that came from the father. But if you have a Jewish mother, that was pretty magnanimous to say you were included. Okay.
Well, and-
Because unless she was an adulteress, the father had to be a Jew, so you were 100% Jew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be the preferred.
Yeah.
They discourage intermarriage with Gentiles.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, did I, where did I leave
Well,
that?
and
Oh.
women were regarded as a deformation in a way, of not only just socially lesser than men, but biologically lesser, because we don't carry the seed for future generations. And all a woman is an oven, basically.
Yeah, like an incubator or
Like,
something. Yeah, a woman didn't have much of a role, and so and there was, the ancients had serious conversations about whether or not a woman was truly human.
Oh, absolutely, and at the very end of the Gospel of Thomas, the very last saying seems to be a very negative saying in reference to women, but part of that is that they're elevating a woman to the same stature as a man in that, if you take a good look
Yeah,
at that.
and where they have Jesus saying, the Gospel of Thomas is interesting, but I don't think he reflects authentic sayings of Jesus in many cases. But they
It's
have,
Gnostic, okay?
yeah, it's from a heretical group, but they had Jesus saying, well, we'll make her a man.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that, you know, because she wasn't good enough as a woman, we'll just make her into a man. Okay.
It's clearly cultural conditioning of the time.
So I forgot what verse was I on?
We're not going to do.
Magical art, robbery, double-heartedness, deceit, haughtiness, depravity, okay, I think we did that whole list. Now, then, verse 2, the way of death is the way of those who persecute the good, hate the truth, love lies, and do not understand the reward for righteousness. They do not cleave to good or righteous judgment. They do not watch for what is good, but for what is evil. They are strangers to meekness, that's humility, and patience, loving vanities, pursuing revenge without pity for the needy and oppressed. They do not know their Creator. They are murderers of children, destroyers of God's image. They turn away from those who are in need, making matters worse for those who are distressed. They are advocates for the rich, unjust judges of the poor. In a word, the way of death is full of those who are steeped in sin. Be delivered, children, from all of this.
Amen.
Oh,
Can I just have
Yes.
clarification on the double-heartedness?
Oh.
What might be an example of
Double what?
double-heartedness?
It's in
Referring
one,
to the
it's in
pure
one.
of-
yeah,
Pure spirit.
being double-minded.
Pure of heart.
What would be, anyone, what would be an example of being
Double-heartedness.
double-heartedness?
Playing both sides of the fence, not being genuine.
Yeah. Hypocrisy comes to mind.
Yeah. I
Saying
think
one
this-
thing and doing another.
Yeah,
Saying one thing and doing another.
well,
Well, or claiming you're doing one thing for God or within the context of God's will when you're really doing it for selfish reasons and purposes.
So doing it, but
Mixed motives, in other words.
mixed motives.
that's a good mixed motives. I like this thing about being on the fence that you said, Liz, because I find myself sometimes doing that. I'm wavering. I'm vacillating. You know, it's like I want to keep all my options open, so I won't make up my mind to do what is right.
Or piety on the outside, but
Yeah,
hard-heartedness on the inside.
yeah,
Sort of like the Pharisees.
yeah,
That's kind of
Oh,
like
a whitewashed sepulcher.
yeah. Oh,
And I think it's interesting that they name astrology in here,
yeah,
because that's trying to foretell the future other than through God.
Yeah.
Yep.
By observing the movement of the heavenly bodies, yeah, which was widespread in the ancient world. It was a big thing. People believe that things happen because they were fated to happen, and your fate is determined by the movements of stars and planets. So it's kind of a
Still
rigid.
people doing it.
Yeah. Nancy
Like
Reagan,
it-
yeah, American policy. Before I make this decision, I'll consult the astrologer.
And she did.
Yeah, well, a lot of ancient leaders did the same. Okay, chapter 6. See that no one leads you astray from the way of this teaching, since all other teachings train you without God. For if you are able to bear the entire yoke of the Lord, you will be perfect. But if you're not able, then at least do what you can. See how pragmatic that is? I mean, the ideal is to be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Do the
That's
best you
That's from
can.
Matthew's gospel. But I like the way they add it. But if you can't be not able to be perfect, then at least do the best you can.
All works in progress.
Yeah. Concerning food, do what you are able to do, and be on guard against meat offered to idols, for that is to worship dead gods. And I put in here Acts 15:29 because at the Council of Jerusalem, that was one of the things that the elders or the apostles asked of Gentile converts, please don't eat meat offered to idols. This was a big issue in the first century. Even the Jews who were not Christians were arguing with each other because the meat market in town, quite often the best cuts of meat were to be found at the. So when they would sacrifice the animal, they'd take the meat and they would sell it as a fundraiser. You know, we do bake sales now. They did.
Sales.
Yeah.
I was reading this thing also that said that most of the parties happen in temples.
Yes.
And so the Jews were seen as, and the Christians also, were seen as a bit standoffish because they wouldn't come and party, because they wouldn't socialize the way everybody else
Yeah.
socializes.
Antisocial.
Antisocial,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. Wow.
So, I have a question.
Yes.
Rather than a tailgate party, that you're saying all that bounty was disposed of, or given to the poor, or?
The temples.
The
pagan temple.
offerings to the god.
Yeah. No, they saw it as a source of income for the temple. They would sell the meat.
Yeah, but after it was cooked, then what?
Where the body?
This says they don't eat it.
Yeah. Well, the Christians shouldn't be going to the local temple meat market. It's-
You go to the kosher store.
Pagan butcher,
yeah.
do not enter if you're Christian.
Yeah. So, yeah, and that might be, and that was hard for some of the Greeks and the Romans to give up the practice because it probably was a normal part of their life when they could buy meat. They would go to the local temple to buy meat. So the temple doubled in the ancient world as not only a place for religious rites, but also as the local meat market.
It was the
So
pagan
it
temple.
would be offered to God and then somebody would come along and sneak it off the
No,
altar?
No,
They would
sold
offer it to the gods, and they would burn a portion of it, and the rest of it
Yeah.
belonged to the priests to eat.
Never-
But the priests couldn't eat all of these sacrifices. So then what did they do? They would sell it. Someone got the idea, we can make money.
But this is the pagan temple.
Yeah, we're talking about we're not talking about the temple in Jerusalem. We're talking about the pagan temples.
Pagan
Yeah. Okay, turn over to chapter 7.
So what did the Jewish temple do?
Well, I don't know if they sold meat at the Jewish temple. I think the priests consumed it and their families and the Levites, and that was a lot of people.
Yeah, the food went to the priests and the
Yeah,
families.
it was the way the priests made their living.
Yeah.
Concerning baptism, this is interesting because we get an idea of how baptism was practiced. Where the other New Testament documents will talk about baptism, they don't tell us the mode. This tells us the mode. So we get a glimpse into the first century church. Concerning baptism, you should baptize in this way. After first explaining all things, baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit in flowing water. Now, that baptismal formula in the New Testament is only found in Matthew's Gospel, and it shows up here. You see the affinity between the two? documents. And now, listen to this, verse 2. But if you have no running water, water that's flowing, baptize in other water. I guess water that is still. And if you cannot do it so in cold water, which was the preference, then in warm water. And if you have very little water, pour water 3 times on the head in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. So what this tells us, and this is really interesting because within recent centuries, among Protestants and Catholics, there's been this great debate on the proper mode of baptism. I was raised as a Baptist, and in the Baptist church, they did not recognize a baptism unless you were put completely under immersion. If you were sprinkled like the Presbyterians or had water poured on you like the Ruperts, we're going to rebaptize you because we're not sure. And but here it shows you that in the first century, it didn't matter the amount of water. There was preferences, but anything will do. If you had to, and you're in a desperate situation, use your saliva. The important thing is get the baptism done.
But the thing is, I think that's the most important thing, is even before any ecumenical council that talked about the formula for baptizing, it was the Trinity.
Oh, excellent insight there.
I mean, look how early the Trinity is there.
Already you have the Trinity named in persons, and this is first century. So
Yeah, they already believed that, and then when they got to councils, they were, they made up their mind whether
Very
they
good
all
point.
agreed to it or not.
Very good point.
and when they say, when Jesus says in the name, in Matthew's gospel, as well as here, the name is singular. Notice that? Baptized in the, it doesn't say in the names, in the name, singular, and then it adds 3 persons. So already, in some, they may not have understood the Trinity, but they already knew.
Like you said, this isn't theological,
Right.
but it took councils to come up with theology,
Yeah.
to the bishops, the councils, put in the theology to, to make it a deal.
And why in flowing water?
Yeah.
It is an image of the Spirit.
Yeah, I think because Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, maybe, and that was flowing water. Maybe they thought flowing water was the
Well,
preferred.
and even back to Genesis with the Spirit hovering over the waters.
Moving over the waters.
And things from Vatican II say the water should be flowing.
Yeah.
And because one of the things they say about liturgy is that liturgy is the font of and the summit of the church's activity, and everything flows from it.
Yes.
And I went to Newman Center in Riverside this last Sunday, in front of their altar, with all the flowers and everything around it. They covered their metal altar, that's strange, but they covered it with something that looks like rocks, some kind of piece of thing that looks like rock, and then they draped some white sheer material coming down the rock to look like a waterfall.
Oh, how beautiful.
And
It was,
to a liturgist, I got that one right away.
wow, that's great.
Because here's the water coming
Flowing
from
water.
the liturgy.
I like that. It's dynamic, you know.
Yes.
Well, and the one thing about moving water, it stays pure. Once the
Yes.
water sits still, that's why, the pool the baptismal font that we blessed at Easter, well, tomorrow Diane and I are going to be taking that down because it's already getting, things are growing in it. It's going to be a swamp, so.
Yeah, most churches, especially after Vatican II,
Yeah.
that they build new churches and everything, many of them have a 2-layered font. The top is smaller bold for baptizing children, and then the bigger font for the catechumens to actually get immersed.
It's flowing.
And it's got the jets that keep moving.
Wow. Someday. Yeah. Before the baptism, now look at this. Before the baptism, both the baptizer and the candidate for baptism, plus any others who can, should fast. The candidate should fast for 1 or 2 days beforehand.
you know, what this is alluding to that is now in the RCIA, I mean, it came back from Vatican II, is that after the fast of Lent, starting with Triduum, Holy Thursday night, you do the Easter fast
Wow.
until Vigil.
Wow.
And that's what
So
they
fasting is very early practice in the
Yeah.
church.
Did they just stop eating? Or
What's that?
Did they just stop eating for fasting? Here we have so many different ways of fasting.
Yeah, well, there's a difference, as far as I understand, and I may be wrong, but there's a difference between abstinence and fasting. Abstinence is when you give up certain things, like meat on Friday, or you give up a certain kind of food during Lent. That's abstinence. Fasting is where you don't eat at all.
Not necessarily, well, now in the, it's like when you fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, it's, the Roman rule is the two of the meals should not equal the biggest meal of the day.
That's what we were trying.
Two
Yeah.
of the meals, what?
The two meals, say your breakfast and your lunch should be smaller than your, two meals should be combined no bigger than the biggest meal of your day. So in other words, two small meals and then one.
So I guess there's various ways you can
Yeah.
interpret and practice fasting.
Yeah, there's some people go to the extreme and not fast for days on end.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not completely not eating.
No,
At least, last 30 years in the Diocese of Orange, it was that formula.
yeah, yeah.
It was basically, keep your meal modest, because you have to, you have to keep up your strength.
Yeah.
But it was, yes, two meals that would not be greater than whatever the biggest meal of your day is, whether it's lunch or dinner.
That's interesting.
So the idea is to have one really, really big meal.
Well,
Can
it's
you
supposed to be
slow down and
modest.
say that,
No,
Ned?
not
Ned,
necessarily
She
your,
wants to get it in the notes what you just
Can you
said.
say that again? I didn't get it.
Well, the
Two
rule,
meals.
and they used to publish this at the beginning of Lent, that fasting means,
two smaller
Two small
meals,
meals
and those two combined
should not be more than the third meal.
yeah, you should,
The larger meal.
the largest meal. But even that large meal should be a little less than, you don't, well, the bigger meal can't be just a big old steak dinner and all that stuff.
right, and
That
fasting,
should be smaller.
and fasting and abstinence.
It's not fast.
Abstinence meant no meat.
Yeah, so if that fasting and abstinence for Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, no meat, and then you did this one
I
meal
see.
eating.
But it was no meat any Friday in Lent.
Well, yeah,
That's what
we
it used to
were
be.
going,
Yeah.
yeah, but after, well,
Started
then
with
after
Ash
Vatican
Wednesday.
II,
All
it was
Fridays.
up to each bishop to decide. So then it got real messy.
Mean it's up to the bishop to decide? I mean, I can issue forth.
Yes.
Sure, if you're Roman Catholic.
Get push.
Okay. Well, in the Hebrew scriptures, fasting was the way that you humbled yourself before God. When it says, humble yourself before God, it was understood that you fast. Because when you stop eating, you all of a sudden realize how dependent you are upon your Creator. And so a way of showing you humility before God was to fast. That's the way that it is in the Hebrew scriptures. So humble yourself in the sight of the Lord,
That's the way
fasting.
Muslims fast.
What's that?
Muslims fast that way, no food at all.
All day except after sundown.
After
when they-
sundown,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Another thing that got, after Vatican II, that bishops got to decide by diocese was when to do confirmations. Because like in Minneapolis, my nephew was confirmed the day he received First Communion.
Oh,
And then other priests or bishops would have confirmation later. So after Vatican II, the bishops got some latitude, and so it depends on which bishop you're under. Gee,
Yeah.
what do we want him not to do to us?
That'll be a good question. Okay, chapter 8, and it looks like this is about as far as we're gonna get, which is exactly halfway through. So we're gonna pick it up next week. Are you appreciating this?
Yeah.
Yes, very
Okay. All right, I'm glad you're enjoying this. Your fast, talking about fasting, your fast should not be with the hypocrites, for they fast on Mondays and Thursdays. And this is a derogatory term. The hypocrites are referring to are the Pharisees. And they did fast on Mondays and Thursdays. No, it shouldn't be like that. You should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. and interestingly enough, the only 2 days in which fasting is observed or pretty much required in Catholicism is Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So Wednesdays and Fridays became
kinda
the Christian.
stuck.
Yeah.
Western Church start arguing about which days to fast.
It could be, but this would predate that. This is
wait.
first century. Yeah, but
way
yeah.
Much later.
Verse 2, and do not pray like the hypocrites, but rather as the Lord commanded in the gospel. Now we don't know if he's referring to Matthew's gospel or to Q, but the Our Father in the Didache is exactly the same as the Our Father in Matthew's gospel. You see the affinity? We have an Our Father prayer in Luke's gospel, but it's different. So here is the Our Father in heaven, holy be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us enough bread day by day. And forgive us our trespasses as we have also forgiven those who trespass against us. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but deliver us from the evil one. By the way, in Matthew's gospel, we see it translated in English, and deliver us from evil, and that's why we say it in the church. But even in Matthew's gospel, it's the evil one. You know, when Jesus gave that prayer, he's thinking of the devil. But we just say evil as if it's some sort of abstract thing. Pray this 3 times a day. So pray the Our Father 3 times a day. This is the beginning of the Liturgy of the Hours, where there are certain times that are marked out for prayer. And here we have it in the Didache that in the very first century, they're already marking out the day by times of prayer. So when you get up in the morning, pray the Our Father. At midday, pray the Our Father. And when you go to bed, pray the Our Father. Those of you who came to Rosary today, you already said it 5 times today. And we'll say it again tonight before we leave. So this will be a good, any other thoughts about what you just looked at? We'll pick up with chapter 9 of the Didache next week. Are you enjoying this?
Yes, very much.
Gentiles.
What's that?
It's like Leviticus for Gentiles.
Yeah, Leviticus for Gentiles. You know what? It's got all the regulations and codes. Yeah.
Well, I'm finding, it might just be the translation or something, but it seems almost like, you know how they have the Bible in modern English?
Yeah.
It kind of has that kind of tone in it to me. It doesn't sound, for lack of a better term, biblical, sort of, you know, in terms of the biblical language. And
Yeah.
the meter and the, you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, this is a fairly recent translation.
Okay.
And I did do some adaptation.
But I suppose you can find one that's very difficult to read, like a King James or something like that.
Yeah, the Greek text, would be awkward
Yeah.
to do a literal
I guess,
translation.
yeah.
So this is
Okay.
a readable translation, which I think is great.
Yeah.
And by the time we're done with this, I hope that you all say, this should be in the New Testament.
Most of it is.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. And those of you who are watching this Bible study, if you would like to have a copy of this text, we can send it to you via email. Just contact us, and we will be happy to send you the text of the Didache. Any intentions you would like to offer?
I would like you all to pray for my grandson and his family. They delivered him to new school today. It was a very emotional journey.
Trevor is his name, Trevor.
And Roger, Trevor.
Prayers for my sister too, who had surgery yesterday and is having a hard time. Her name is Laverne.
And I still want to for us to give prayer to the Christians in the Middle East.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
prayers.
for Michael, who is undergoing atrial fibrillation, and
Yeah.
hoping that the medication will stabilize you.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
And we have a friend, Kathy, who's having pancreatic cancer Whipple surgery today. Huh? It went well.
We will keep these prayers in mind, but I want to do something a little different this evening. This is a serious situation for Michael, and why don't we lay
Yes.
hands on him and gather around? Let's just make a special intercession for him. Yeah. It's the CS. The one that has, no, not CS. OI. Michael, we're going to anoint you.
Okay. Turn around.
Michael, why don't you sit down? Gather around and lay hands on. This is really great. Do this holy anointing, Lord, praise you. We hear you. So we offer this prayer for our brother Michael in the confidence that you care for us. And so we place all our anxiety, fear, and worry into your hands, O Lord. We put our trust in your Son Jesus. And we know that you are with our brother Michael, that you love him deeply, and that you embrace him. And so we put him into your hands, O Lord, trusting you to care for him. And we offer this prayer as we pray now in the words Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.